Welcome, welcome, welcome. Drop your names in the chat, everyone. Drop your name in the chat, guys. Drop your name in the chat, guys. Adam, welcome. Let's go, everyone. Dan K, how are you? Subscribe, Dan K. Drop your names in the chat, guys. Drop your name in the chat. Kayla, welcome. Chantel, welcome in. Subscribe to my channel, Chantel. And we have is Gmail. Subscribe Gmail. Alright, you should. Then we have is Dorian. How are you, Dorian? Subscribe to my channel. Dorian. Then we have is Niobe. Subscribe, Niobe. Niobe. Subscribe. And then we have is Bella. How are you, Bella? Subscribe, Bella. Then we have is Lohendi. Lohendi. Then we have is Alwilda. Alwilda. Subscribe, Alwilda. Subscribe to my channel. Then we have is Kirthana. Subscribe, Kirthana. Kirthana. Subscribe my channel. Everyone subscribe. Cool, subscribe. Everyone subscribe. Anna, subscribe to my channel. Everyone like the live. Double tap, Livy. Welcome in. Subscribe, Livy. Subscribe to my channel. Lundai, subscribe. Subscribe to my channel. Renata, subscribe to my channel. And guys, like my live. Like my live. Guys, come on. Maida, welcome in. Maida, subscribe. Maida. And then we have is Piper. Subscribe, Piper. Subscribe. Then we have is Jess. Subscribe to my channel, Jess. There you go. Then we have Harper. Subscribe, Harper. Subscribe. You'll see. And then how is Aubrey? Subscribe, Aubrey. Subscribe to my channel. Aubrey, subscribe. We have is Mira. Subscribe to my channel, Mira. Then we have is Siri. Subscribe to my channel, Siri. Then we have is Ellie. Subscribe, Ellie. Subscribe to my channel. And then after that, we have Luke. Subscribe, Luke. Subscribe to my channel. Everyone subscribe. Guys, hit that like button. Let's go. Addie, welcome in. Subscribe. Addie, hope you're doing well. And after Addie, we have Siphon. How are you, Siphon? Subscribe to my channel, Siphon. Everyone subscribe. Let's go, guys. Everyone subscribe. Darcy, subscribe, Darcy. Darcy, subscribe. And then after that, we have Sophie. How are you? Subscribe, Sophie. Subscribe to my channel. Let's go. Nayeli, subscribe, Nayeli. Nayeli. Subscribe, Nayeli. Then we have is Aknura. Aknura, subscribe, Aknura. Then we have is Brandon. Subscribe, Brandon. Subscribe. Then we have is Elijah. Subscribe, Elijah. Subscribe to my channel. Then we have is Ohana. How are you, Ohana? Subscribe, Ohana. And then after Ohana, it's gonna be Sapna. Subscribe. And we have is Kendrick. Subscribe, Kendrick. Kendrick, subscribe. We have Lena. Subscribe, Lena. Finley, subscribe. Let's go, everyone. Let's get to 30 likes, guys. Let's get to 30 likes. Everyone, double tap. Double tap the live, guys. Everyone, double tap the live. Let's go. Ezra. And we have is Ariana. How are you, Ariana? Subscribe, Ariana. We have Liam. Subscribe, Liam. Zenner. Subscribe, Zenner. Subscribe. Blessings, subscribe. Nathan, subscribe. Carey, subscribe, Carey. And we have after Carey is gonna be alright, medicine, thank you. Medicine. Then we have this Kinsley. Subscribe, Kinsley. Then we have is Romana. Subscribe, Romana. And then we have is Bella. Subscribe, Bella. After Bella, it's gonna be It's gonna be Hera. Subscribe Hera. It's gonna be Edlin. Subscribe Edlin. Then we have his Neve. Subscribe Neve. Then we have is Rima. Subscribe Rima. Then we have is Minecraft. Subscribe Minecraft. Jonathan, subscribe. Subscribe, Jonathan. Leah is next. Subscribe, Leah. Then we have is Nadia. Subscribe, Nadia. Subscribe. Geo, subscribe. Then we have is Lena Lee. Subscribe, Lena Lee. Lena Lee. Then we have is Benno. Subscribe, Benno. Subscribe to my channel. Win. Subscribe, Win. Then we have is Logan. Logan, subscribe. Alexia, subscribe. Alexia. And then we have a Sunny. How are you, Sunny? Subscribe to my channel, Sunny. Then we have is Florence. How are you, Florence? Subscribe. Then we have is Chad. Subscribe, Chad. Then we have is Brooke. How are you, Brooke? Subscribe. Alright. Okay, Michaela. How are you, Michaela? There you go, Michaela. And then we have Asma. And then we have is Miss Sherry. Subscribe, Miss Sherry. And then we have is Lawand. Subscribe, Lawand. Thank you very much. Mireille, subscribe, Mireille. Alright, let's go. Lulu, subscribe. There's Annabelle, subscribe, Annabelle. Then we have this Emil, subscribe, Emil. Then we have is you're welcome, Miriam. Leah, subscribe. Then we have is Ariana. Hi Ariana, subscribe Ariana. Then we have is Michael, subscribe Michael. Huggy, how are you, Huggy? Subscribe. Harlow, subscribe. Subscribe, Orisha. Then we have is Lewis, subscribe. Vicente, subscribe. have is Liana. Subscribe Liana. Gatlin, how are you, Gatlin? Subscribe to my channel. We have is Harper. Subscribe Harper. And then we have is Mirai. Subscribe Mirai. And then we have is Asinat. Subscribe Asinat. We have Skylar. Subscribe Skylar. Then after Skylar, we got Rabia. Subscribe Rabia. We have is Layla. Subscribe Layla. Then we have Kevin. How are you, Kevin? Subscribe Kevin. Then we have is Hales. Subscribe Hales. Then we have is Adriana. Subscribe Adriana. Then we have is Estelle. Subscribe Estelle. Subscribe Hiba. After that we have is Nayla. Subscribe Nayla. And then we have is Ashley. Subscribe Ashley. And then we have is Dima. Subscribe Dima. Everyone subscribe, like. Then we have is Alana. How are you, Alana? Subscribe. Is Sophia. Subscribe Sophia. And then we have Rhea. Subscribe Rhea. There we are. And then we have is Kieran. Subscribe Kieran. Subscribe Piper. How are you? Subscribe Piper. Piper. And then we have is Nicole. How are you, Nicole? Subscribe to my channel, Nicole. There you go. Then we have is Poppy. Subscribe Poppy. Oh. Then we have is Josie. Subscribe. Then we have is Stefania. Subscribe Stefania. Stefania. Then we have is Leo. Subscribe Lily. Then we have is Ava. Subscribe Ava. Then we have is Amanda. How are you, Amanda? Subscribe to my channel. Everyone subscribe. Then we have Cassie. Then we have is Kinsley. Then we have is Haven. Then we have is Lexi. Thanks, Lexi. And then we have is Bentley. And then we have is Zachary. And then we have is Oliver. Subscribe Oliver, Zachary. Whoops. Alright. Then we have is Lily. And then we have is Owen. Subscribe Lily, Owen, subscribe Mapley, subscribe Mapley. have is Sarah. Let me slow it down a little bit. Then we have is Era. Disha. Subscribe, everyone. Is Ina. Subscribe. Then we have is Matthew. How are you, Matthew? Subscribe, Matthew. Then we have is Ida. Subscribe, Ida. And we have is Emma. Emma, subscribe. Then we have is Leah. Subscribe. Then we have is Oakley. Subscribe, Oakley. Subscribe to my channel. Then we have is Princess. Subscribe, Princess. And then we have is Ava. Subscribe, Ava. Then we have is Andra. Then we have is Summer. Okay, and then we have is Leon. And then we have is Shira. Everyone subscribe. Shira, subscribe. Kahila, how are you, Kahila? Subscribe. Then we have is Amir. Then we have is Anton. How are you, Anton? Subscribe to my channel, Anton. Subscribe. Sona. Subscribe. Sona, subscribe to my channel. Everybody subscribe. Then we have is Mia. Subscribe, Mia. Then we have is Sarah. Subscribe, Sarah. Then we have is Ace. Subscribe, Ace. Then we have is Kim. And we have Alexa. Subscribe. Kuro. Subscribe. Then we have Isaiah. Isaiah. Yeah. Then we have a Zoe. Subscribe, Zoe. Then we have is Eris. Subscribe, Eris. Subscribe. Yusuf, subscribe, Yusuf. Okay, and then we have is Lily. Subscribe, Lily. And then we have is Tyler. Celeste. Subscribe, Celeste. Don't forget to subscribe. Bob, subscribe to my channel. Summer. Subscribe, Summer. Then we have is Lay. Subscribe, Lay. Then we have is Iofe. Subscribe, Iofe. Then we have is Caden. Subscribe, Caden. Savannah. Saveva. Subscribe, Saveva. Then we have is then we have is Selena. Then we have is Jade. And then we have is Laura. Subscribe, Laura. And then we have is Nakime. Subscribe, Nakime. And then Avery. Subscribe, Avery. Subscribe. And then we have is Jameson. Subscribe, Jameson. And then is Samantha. Subscribe, Samantha. After Samantha, we have is Nagi. Subscribe, Nagi. Is Dawson. How are you, Dawson? Subscribe. We have Ania. Subscribe, Ania. Aurora. Subscribe, Aurora. Then we have is Nate. How are you, Nate? Subscribe. Is Leela. Subscribe, Leela. Everyone like and subscribe. Then we have is Chan. Subscribe, Chan. And then we have is you're welcome. Looney. And we have is then we have is Bella. Mia. Then we have is Lele. Danny. How are you, Danny? Subscribe. Then we have is thank you very much. Thank you, Richard. And then we have is then we have is Eliza. We have is Caden. How are you, Caden? Hope you are well. We have is Ari. Alright guys, I gotta go now. Thank you all so much for your support. I'll see you again in the next live, hopefully. And guys, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe to my channel. Hit that bell notification icon thing. That way you will be notified whenever I go live. And okay, thank you all. Take care, bye.